So this is the Commander's Beacon, and I'm Eric. And we like to talk about some unconventional ways that you might build your Commander deck, kind of like making a peanut butter and ketchup sandwich on rye bread. Delicious. But today we're talking about Mutate. Now, Mutate is probably one of the most complex mechanics ever created, other than maybe banding or something. But the question is, can we make Mutate work in Commander? Okay, so I want to talk to you about Mutate. The Mutate mechanic was released with Ikoria, and it allows you to combine multiple creatures into a single chimeric abomination that's just asking to get 2 for 1 with a kill spell, or 3 for 1, or 4 for 1. Okay, so why do we want to do this? First, let's discuss the mechanics of Mutate a bit. It's fairly simple on the surface, but even fairly standard events during fairly standard games can actually cause it to be one of Magic's most frustratingly complicated mechanics. Okay, so you're asking again, why do we want to do this? Well, it doesn't matter, we're doing it. First, what is Mutate? The Mutate mechanic appears as an alternative casting mechanism for some creatures. So by paying the Mutate cost to cast the spell, you can have it combine with another target non-human creature under your control, rather than enter the battlefield as a separate creature. So the combined creature will be treated as a single card and a single creature for all intents and purposes once it's on the battlefield. And when you cast a Mutate creature onto another creature and it resolves, you'll pick the creature that you cast to either go on top or on the bottom of the existing creature. The term top here really just means that the creature type, color, casting cost, and power and toughness that is visible. In other words, nope, they don't even add the power and toughness together when you mutate a creature, unfortunately. And the mutated creature will have the text box abilities of all creatures that it's comprised of. So this is kind of complicated to talk about by itself, so let's go over an example. Let's say I have an almighty brushwag on the battlefield, and I cast a Porcuparrot for its mutate cost, which is 2 and a red, and I target the brushwag. So if it resolves, I will then have a single creature, and upon resolution I get to choose whether that creature is Almighty Brushwag, a 1/1 green brushwag, or Porcuparrot, a 3/4 red bird beast. Hint, you will probably choose Porcuparrot to be on top. In either case, that creature will have trample and pay 3 and a green to give it +3/+3 until end of turn from the brushwag, and it will also have tap to deal X damage to any target, where X is the number of times this creature is mutated from the Porcuparrot. So, similarly to the bestow mechanic, if the target of any mutate spell becomes illegal before the spell resolves, for example, if someone casts murder on my poor brushwag when I target it with a mutating Porcuparrot, the Porcuparrot will still resolve, but as a standalone creature rather than as a mutation. So once a mutated creature resolves, it's treated as a single creature or card once it's on the battlefield. Yeah, so if it goes to the graveyard, for example by being killed, then all the cards go to the graveyard. If it's exiled, then all of the cards become exiled, etc. There's all sorts of mind-bending scenarios in which it isn't really obvious what happens to all of the cards under a mutated creature unless maybe you're a level 37 judge, but I'm not, so we're not going to talk about those today. So at this point, you're still probably asking, why would I want to play Mutate? Unlike auras, which have a similar risk of 2 for 1ing yourself or worse, mutation doesn't necessarily buff the creature's power each time it happens. You'll cap out at probably a 6/6 or so, no matter how many times you mutate, and that's kind of not cool. But often when something mutates, it triggers an ability, kind of like a spell. When Boneyard Lurker mutates, for example, you get to return a permanent card from your graveyard to your hand. Insatiable Hemophage causes each opponent to lose X life, and you gain X life whenever it mutates, where X is the number of times the creature is mutated. When Trumpeting Gnar mutates, you get to create a 3/3 green beast token. So some of these creatures have compounding effects that get better if you've mutated a creature several times, like the Insatiable Hemophage. Others are more linear, triggering something when the creature mutates, but not caring how many times it's mutated in the past. Now, Mutate also works really well to make some small creatures instantly big. If I have a Cold-Eyed Selkie on the battlefield since the beginning of my turn, and I mutate a Mind Leecher onto it, it's suddenly a 5/5 flyer with Island Walk, letting me draw 5 cards when it hits an opponent. And nope, it doesn't have Summoning Sickness because it's not a new creature. And let's not forget about something ridiculous to mutate like Elusive Tormentor, which transforms into Assidious Mists, and then your opponents flip the table or something. So this is a cool way to use Mutate. But today I want to talk about another possibility. We're going to try to abuse the Mutate triggered abilities by using them over and over and over. Let's talk about how we can do that. So in order to get a Mutate trigger, for example from Migratory Greathorn, we need two things. First, we need a creature on the board to mutate onto. Second, we need to cast Migratory Greathorn for its mutate cost, and of course it needs to resolve. This is a bit restrictive. We can't return a creature with mutate from our graveyard to the battlefield because it won't mutate if we do. We can't blink a mutate creature because, again, this won't allow it to mutate. It'll just re-enter the battlefield as a non-mutated creature. So we're going to focus on bounce effects. Crystal Shard, Erratic Portal, Unsummon, and the like. Here's the plan. So we mutate 2 or 3 or 4 creatures together and get 2 or 3 or 4 mutate triggers, and then we bounce the creature back to our hand. And this is going to return all of the mutated cards to our hand. Then we just recast them for their mutate costs and do it all over again. We can repeatedly nuke our opponent's artifacts and enchantments with Gemrazor, or their creatures with Dirgebat, or their hands with Cavern Whisperer. We can repeatedly draw cards with Dreamtail Heron, cast spells with CMC 3 or less from our graveyard with Vadrak, Apex of Thunder, or steal non-creature artifacts with Souvenir Snatcher. There's a ton of value and control if you can repeatedly mutate creatures together, but this costs a lot of mana. We're going to need some help with these casting costs if we're going to be able to afford to do this. And we'll talk about that in a bit when we discuss possible commanders for this deck, but first we need to talk a little bit more about these bounce effects. So there's 2 ways you can use bounce effects to recast mutate creatures. The first is with spells or permanents that can bounce your creatures, like White Mane Lion, Crystal Shard, Into the Royal. There's a variety of instant spells and repeated use permanents that you can use to return your creatures to your hand. And some of them, like Into the Royal, can be used defensively as well to remove a big creature that happens to be swinging at you. And then you can take this even further and you can pick cheap creatures with Enter the Battlefield effects to mutate onto for even more value. Baleful Strix and Elvish Visionary draw a card when they enter, and for only 2 mana. And Burglar Rat makes each opponent discard a card. Cloud of Fairies untaps 2 lands, so it's basically free. But outside of bounce effects or spells, there's another way to bounce creatures. By mutating onto creatures that bounce themselves. Hibernation Sliver lets you pay 2 life to return it to your hand. Mutate anything you want onto the sliver, then pay 2 life, return it to your hand whenever you need to. Cavern Harpy can bounce itself for 1 life. Lantern Spirit is a 2/1 flyer that can bounce itself for 1 blue mana. Blinking Spirit is a little expensive at 4 mana to cast, but it bounces itself for free. When you use these self-bouncing creatures, you are a bit limited in terms of what you can mutate onto. There aren't a ton of creatures that have this ability. But you're going to gain the insane versatility of being able to bounce your mutated guys back to your hand whenever you want, in response to being targeted for removal or a board wipe, for example. It's going to be nearly impossible for your opponents to permanently get rid of your mutated creatures. So, now we have our strategy, but how are we going to make it work? And how can we generate the mana to keep recasting these mutate spells repeatedly? And then once we've done all that, how can we actually win the game? You'll notice that a lot of these mutate creatures hinder our opponents, or they give us some incremental advantage, but they don't actually generate anything that really lets us win the game. And I think that's one of the biggest weaknesses of mutate creatures. You might have trouble closing out the game quickly. Let's talk about some possible commander options that might address these issues. Okay, so who's going to lead our Mutate deck? There's no single best answer that I could find yet, but I want to discuss 3 possible options. But first, we kind of need to be concerned about the number of mutate creatures that are available. Since they were only released in Ikoria and Commander 2020, we're pretty limited. So how many colors do we want to use? Across all 5 colors, there's only 34 creatures with mutate. Some of them are probably fairly unplayable in this slow, control-y deck design, like Huntmaster Liger or Regal Leosaur probably will not be seeing much play here. So we need to be really careful about playing enough colors to have enough mutate creatures at our disposal. Let's start by considering Ramos Dragon Engine. Ramos is a 4/4 artifact dragon creature for 6 colorless mana. It has, whenever you cast a spell, put a +1/+1 counter on Ramos Dragon Engine for each of that spell's colors, and yes, that does include mutate spells. And then you can remove 5 +1/+1 counters from Ramos to add 2 Wooburg, that's 10 total mana, 2 of each color, and you can only do this once per turn. So Ramos gives us access to all 5 colors, and it will help us pay for the repeated mutate casting costs. Now, lots of mutate creatures have 2 or 3 colors, so it's going to add 2 or 3 +1/+1 counters to Ramos per cast, and then he can remove those counters to help us fuel future mutate casts. And finally, we can mutate onto Ramos in a pinch if we need to, and then he can be pretty big. So if we want to generate even more mana, we can consider Gigantha the Wellspring as a companion. Now, just for a quick reference, if you're not familiar with the companion mechanic, I'm going to do another video detailing the companion mechanic in more detail in the future, but just briefly here, there are 10 different companion creatures that were released with Ikoria. Any deck can have a companion as long as it fits the commander's color identity and the companion's deck restriction. The companion starts the game basically in an out-of-game zone, kind of like a sideboard, but not really. And no, I don't think the starting zone for the companion is really any more clearly defined than that. Anyways, the companion can be put into your hand at sorcery speed from this companion zone for 3 generic mana, and once it's in your hand, it's just a normal card. If you cast it and it dies, then it's dead. If it gets exiled, it's gone forever. So Gigantha is a companion, which is a 5/5 elemental elk for 4 and a Gruul that has tap, add Wooburg. And this mana can't be used for generic mana costs. Its companion restriction reads, no card in your starting deck has more than 1 of the same mana symbol in its casting cost. So you can't use Gigantha as your companion unless every card in your deck meets this restriction. Now, this will prevent us from playing a few of the more powerful mutate creatures like Dirgebat, Sea Dasher Octopus, and Mind Leecher, but it will definitely help us pay for our mutate costs. We can also consider Umori the Collector as a companion. So Umori is a 4/5 ooze that costs 2 and 2 Golgari, and it has, as Umori the Collector enters the battlefield, choose a card type, creature. Spells you cast of the chosen type, creature. Cost 1 less to cast. Its companion restriction is each non-land card in your starting deck shares a card type, again, creature. So if we use Umori, we can only play creatures and lands in our deck, and all of our creature spells, including our mutate costs, cost 1 less when Umori is on the battlefield. I've played around with this a bit, and honestly I'm not sure this heavy restriction is worth it, but you can consider it. And then finally you can consider running a few cards in the 99 to reduce the casting cost of your mutate spells. Nylea Keen-Eyed reduces your creature spells casting costs by 1 generic mana. Centaur Omen Reader reduces them by 2 as long as it's tapped, but good luck tapping this guy without him dying. Goreclaw, Terror of Kalsisma, and Thrix the Sudden Storm reduces the cost of creature spells with power 4 or greater, or CMC 5 or greater respectively. And Animar, Soul of Elements, gets a +1/+1 counter whenever you cast a creature spell, and then reduces the cost of creature spells by 1 generic mana for each +1/+1 counter on it. Speaking of Animar, he can also be your commander. So, as we said, Animar is a 1/1 elemental that costs red, blue, green. In addition to reducing the cost of your creature spells for each +1/+1 counter on it, it also has protection from black and white. Now, keep in mind that Animar is only 3 colors, so within Temur you'll only have access to 17 mutate creatures, and some of them are not good. No offense, Cloudpiercer. But Animar will easily reduce the generic mana cost of your mutate spells to 0, and you can mutate onto it, and it's a bit harder to remove since it has protection from black and white. So Animar and Ramos will help us pay for repeated Mutate castings, but Ukama Stalking Shadow will instead help us actually finish out games. So if we pick Ukama Stalking Shadow as our commander, it is a 2/2 Whale Wolf that costs 1 blue-black. It's unblockable and has, when Ukama leaves the battlefield, it deals X damage to target player, and you gain X life, where X is its power. And Ukama partners with Khazur, Ruthless Stalker, which is a 3/3 human warrior that has add green to your deck's color identity so you can ramp and stuff. Okay, not really, but as with any Ukama deck, Ukama is the star of the show, and Khazur mostly just sits in the command zone eating Oreos and feeling neglected. So this is a 3-color deck, and I need to point out that you're only going to have access to 20 Mutate creatures in these colors. Fortunately, in my opinion, the best Mutate creatures for Commander are in Sultai. The Ukama Mutate strategy is fairly simple. Mutate some big boy like Brokos, Apex of Forever onto Ukama, and then you have an unblockable 6/6 that does commander damage. And what we're adding with this deck is the possibility to bounce Ukama back to our hand, for example with an unsummon, typically in response to removal or to push a bit more damage. And since we mutated Brokos onto him, this is going to smack an opponent for 6 more damage, gain us 6 life, and then return both Brokos and Ukama to our hand to recast and use again. This bounce mutate version of Ukama and Khazur can do consistent, if somewhat modest damage that can be fairly difficult for your opponents to interact with. Now, unfortunately, this version of the deck doesn't really have any way to help us with the mana costs of these repeated mutations, other than just ramping excessively because you're in green. Good job, Khazur. So that's my take on Mutate and how you might build around it. So we came up with 3 possible commanders in Ramos Dragon Engine, Animar Soul of Elements, and Ukama and Khazur the partner commanders. I don't have a deck tech yet since I haven't decided which route will really work best here. The self-bouncing creatures like Blinking Spirit are very cool, but you can end up in an unfortunate position where you have a bunch of self-bouncing creatures and no Mutate creatures in your hand, or the opposite. Ukama and Khazur work well enough, but since Ukama doesn't bounce itself, you may run into issues finding something to do with your mana if you can't find something to bounce your mutated Ukama back to your hand. And you really don't want too many of these effects in your deck either, because having both Crystal Shard and Erratic Portal on the battlefield at the same time really doesn't help you out at all. But I think this deck does have potential, and I'll certainly bring a complete deck tech to you once I have a build I'm satisfied with. But that is all for now. Please like this video or subscribe if you found this useful or interesting in any way. I will be posting weekly videos describing all sorts of unconventional ways that you can build your commander decks, from budget alternatives to deck techs to top 10 lists. And thank you for watching.